If Mark Carney succeeds so that he gets a majority government without an election, the anger in Alberta will be volcanic. We're going to be looking very seriously at starting a credible independence party in Alberta. We don't need Canada. Canada needs us. We think that Canada separated from Alberta. Like, we're not separating from Canada. Canada has already separated from Alberta. The Alberta independence movement isn't going away. I think that it's looking progressively more and more and more likely that we will win a referendum.
Isn't there a risk that by becoming landlocked, you could actually be worse off? Do you have any concerns that a growing independence movement in Alberta could drive some business out of the province? So you talked a bit about the delegations to the U.S. Has any independence activists actually met with Donald Trump?
The attitude of the U.S. administration towards Alberta independence is overwhelmingly enthusiastic.
There is without a doubt a growing independence movement in Alberta, with polls showing that over 40% of Albertans now believe that their province would be better off outside of Canada. One of the leaders of this independence movement is a man named Jeff Rath. He is a lawyer and has become known for leading delegations to the United States to talk about Alberta independence, something that has garnered controversy and even accusations of treason. While on my recent trip to Alberta to report on this growing independence movement, I visited Rath at his house and we had a wide-ranging conversation. I asked him tough questions, he broke some news, and he made some shocking predictions for what's ahead. And most importantly, he issued a strong warning to Prime Minister Mark Carney that you're not going to want to miss, regardless of where you stand on this issue. But before we get into this interview, I do want to invite you to become a paid channel member. It's less than $5 a month, and it helps fund these types of reporting trips. It helps me stay independent of government funding. And there are bonus questions that I couldn't fit into this 30-minute interview that I asked Jeff Rath that you're not going to want to miss. So click the links below and support independent media today.
Well, Jeff Rath, thank you so much for sitting down with me today. And
My pleasure. I'm glad that you came out west. So
yes, it's always a pleasure to be out in Alberta. Just a few years ago, this idea of Alberta independence, it seemed like arguably a fringe idea or an unrealistic idea, something that was definitely never going to happen. There was never going to be a referendum. And fast forward to today, there is an ongoing campaign to trigger a referendum that has a lot of momentum. And some polls suggest that over 40% of Albertans think their province would be better off outside of Canada. What happened? Why has this movement gone from being seemingly a fringe movement, a small movement, to something that is arguably getting more and more mainstream every day?
Well, I've said it, previously, but I think from our perspective, what's gone on is that we think that Canada separated from Alberta. Like, we're not separating from Canada. Canada has already separated from Alberta. It started with, re-electing Justin Trudeau and leaving Justin Trudeau in power for 10 years. And then I think the straw that broke the camel's back was that when, notwithstanding the fact that Alberta had been decimated by 10 years of Justin Trudeau, the destruction of our economy, the landlocking and the freezing of oil and gas development in Alberta, the destruction of the provincial economy. People in Ontario and Quebec were so stupid as to elect Mark Carney as the Prime Minister of Canada. I mean, a guy that literally thinks oil and gas, who's written in his book Values that oil and gas needs to stay in the ground, that has literally, pledged the destruction of the Western oil and gas economy. They elected him Prime Minister. And at that point, everybody in Alberta said, well, there's no hope. What are we going to do? I mean, it doesn't matter, what we do. The Pierre Poilievre can be ahead 10 or 15 points in the polls. All it takes is some liberal to say, Donald Trump is a bad man, right? And it triggers all of the Trump derangement syndrome in all of the people in Ontario and Quebec that were wearing 3 and 4 masks during COVID, right? And, who have this severe Trump derangement syndrome. And you get this goofy, elbows up campaign where Mark Carney, pays some little guy from the United States by the name of Mike Myers to come up. Mike Myers has 3 different passports, UK, Canada, the United States of America, a triple citizen, to come up and tell Canadians how to be patriotic. And the rest is history. So, that's the problem we have, is that we're sick and tired of being governed, by idiots in Ontario and Quebec that don't understand basic economics and will put complete morons in charge of a multi-trillion-dollar economy.
When did you get involved in the movement?
Honestly, for me, it was COVID, right? I mean, I've never really been involved in the Alberta, independence movement prior to that, but it was when, in my life prior to that, I was on planes every week and I was flying all over the world and doing whatever I wanted. And then Justin Trudeau came out and lied to everybody and told everybody that unvaccinated people were driving the pandemic, that
Mhm.
unvaccinated people were filthy, dangerous, disgusting people, and we shouldn't be allowed on airplanes next to other people's children. And I effectively had my mobility rights under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms stripped away by a drama school dropout in Ottawa, who was feeding the entire country, misinformation and disinformation around the safety and efficacy of experimental vaccines that nobody should have got. And as a result, I became a prisoner of the province of Alberta. And so I turned to a friend one day, quite literally, and I don't know what this says about me in terms of my people. A lot of people accuse me of egotism when they want to displace me as the so-called leader of the independence movement. But what it says about my egotism, because I turned to a friend of mine and I said, if Trudeau won't let me leave Canada, I'm going to have to pick up my entire province and leave. And I've been working on that ever since. And so far it looks like I'm being very successful.
What is, for regular Albertans that are, working families, single moms or retirees, what is the core case for Alberta independence? And specifically, Jeff, what are the purported economic benefits of independence for Alberta?
Well, we actually, before we went into this, we took a lot of time and put a lot of work into this document called The Value of Freedom. This document was developed by economists, actuaries, bankers, business people, et cetera, using a very sophisticated AI model to show people that a free and independent Alberta would be far more successful and far more wealthy and far more prosperous than an Alberta that would remain in Canada. We can afford to end federal income tax year one. We ran, the question, because we're going to be running on this in the referendum campaign. Um, we can afford in year one of independence to completely eliminate federal income tax. We can double CPP and double OAS payments to our senior citizens, stand up an Alberta armed forces, 3% of GDP going to defense, replace all the so-called federal questionable services, border patrol, immigration. We say immigration and deportation because everybody that's here on a work permit, we're going to give a plane ticket to Ottawa, and they can all go back to Ottawa to have Ottawa sort them out, et cetera. So the benefits to Albertans are going to be through the roof, right? So imagine just eliminating, and we're not talking about eliminating all taxes. We're not living in some fantasy world, right?
Mhm.
You have to have a government and you have to have government services and the rest of it. Initially, whatever level, the level of provincial income tax that exists would exist, and existing provincial revenues would remain provincial revenues. But just getting rid of federal income tax is about 25% for every adult, working adult in Alberta. So imagine that you're a police officer making 100 to 110,000 a year. You're married to a nurse that's making between 100 to 150,000 a year, and all of a sudden you don't have to pay federal income tax. Well, that average working couple is going to see their take home pay increase by 50%, or not 50%, $50,000. Think about that, $50,000 in their bank account that they can spend however they want, take care of their kids better, pay down their mortgage, take care of their mom and dad better, whatever it is. The money stays in their pocket, but even better, the money gets spent in the Alberta economy, right? And that's what people, need to internalize. Albertans send $70 billion a year out of Alberta every year, right? In combined, various forms of taxes, CPP and UI. We get less than $20 billion a year back in direct transfers, including health transfers, CPP and UI, and very questionable federal services. Like, as an example, who actually thinks that Alberta gets any national defense from Canada? How are we being defended by Canada? We're not. The government of Canada could not defend Alberta from any any foreign enemy wanting to invade Alberta. It's ludicrous. Right.
So we talked a bit about polling earlier when I mentioned that it's over 40% according to some polls. I've met a lot of people in Alberta, and including a lot of, I would call them fancy people. And these are people I meet at cocktail parties. These are elites who will whisper in my ear, "I'm a separatist," including people in positions of power. And also throughout my time here, I've met a lot of people who tell me I'm not a separatist. I don't want Alberta independence, but I will be voting yes because I want the yes vote to be strong enough to send a message to Ottawa. So, do you think that the in voting intentions for the yes side, if there is to be a referendum, is maybe stronger than 40%, and there may be a silent majority? Or
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And one of the things that we have to look at, in terms of that, is Danielle Smith. Like, I'm not sure who she was talking to or what pollster she was relying on, but she says that there's over between 1 million and 1.5 million Albertans favor independence, right? So keep in mind, we only had a voter turnout in the last provincial election of 1,778,000 people, right? So if 1 million people in Alberta or voters support independence, that's 56%. If it's 1.5 million, it's 84%. So, I mean, Danielle Smith has gone on national television and has said that support for independence in Alberta, in terms of voter turnout or voting public, is between 56% and 84%. So we see that as extremely strong and extremely bullish for independence, much more so than some of the ridiculous outlier polls like that recent Abacus poll that said we were at, 20%, which I think is just ludicrous. I mean, there was an Ecos poll, on the 2nd of February that had us at 41%. So, the polls are kind of all over the map. And there's a Leger poll as well right after the last election, where they said that 70% of conservative voters in Alberta support independence. So keep in mind, 60% of Albertans turned out and voted conservative in the last election. So 60% of 70% is 42%. So that was that was last year when that Leger poll came out. So, and as far as I'm concerned, support for independence has done nothing but go up over the last 12 months while we've been busy educating people, radicalizing people. We've had the images of, mile-long lines of Albertans into the cold January night waiting to sign the petition to take Alberta out of Canada. I mean, it's, all of the momentum is on our side.
if a referendum does not succeed in having a yes win, but you still get a good number, like 40-45%, or maybe even, like in the case of Quebec, a 49-51 situation, do you think that would be politically useful for Alberta, and Alberta would come out of that maybe better? And I ask that because I'm from Quebec, and where there was 2 referendums, and it seems, and a lot of people argue, that since Quebec had the 2 referendums, they've been able to get a lot of what they want from the feds. Do you think that?
Well, let's put it this way: they've been able to get a lot of what they want from Alberta.
But
we're the ones that have been paying. We're the ones that have been
for the equalization.
Yeah, yeah, you're welcome. But I mean, we're the ones that have been
yeah,
paying that. We're the ones that have been paying the tab.
Yes. So, like,
right?
if the no side were to win in a referendum, do you still think that the fact that there was a referendum will make Alberta better off?
Well, we're not going away, right? So the Alberta independence movement isn't going away. On the end, I think that it's looking progressively more and more and more likely that we will win a referendum. We're, not even at the end of the petition campaign yet, and the polls have us at 42%. I mean, I speak to Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon from time to time, and he was telling us that, that referendum that resulted in a, 49.9, percent vote in favor of independence in Quebec, they started the campaign at 30%. We're going to be starting this campaign at 45-50% in the polls. So, and then, we'll be running a structured, disciplined campaign. I'll be a lot more careful about what I say about people and stuff, right? And I'll behave a lot better than I've been behaving now. But, it's going to be interesting, right? And I think we can do it. I honestly do. But if we don't, then, plan B is, it's not, let's pray for Pierre Poilievre to come to Alberta and save us, because he's a federalist. He's a federalist shill. He's not coming to Alberta to save us. He's coming to maintain equalization to Quebec. He's coming to tell us that the dairy mafia and the dairy cartel and supply management is really good for everybody, notwithstanding the fact that Quebec has 10 times more dairy licenses than Alberta, but they only have half the population, not even twice the population. So when there's a 5-to-1 discrepancy between Quebec and Alberta dairy licenses, Pierre Poilievre will do nothing about that because he's like a typical federalist politician that, no disrespect, wants to pander to voters in Quebec to get elected, right? So we're going to be looking very seriously at starting a credible independence party in Alberta to take votes away from the Conservatives, and we'll vote with the Conservatives on issues where they support Alberta, but we'll vote against them or not support them on otherwise. And quite frankly, which will mean that the Conservatives will never form a national government ever again.
If I can follow up and
Uh,
challenge that a bit, like, wouldn't that just make everything worse? Wouldn't that just mean that Liberals would continue getting elected? They'd be more emboldened to be less moderate, knowing that the right is
Well,
good.
and then that'll radicalize Albertans even further. And the next time we have a referendum, we'll win, right? So, I mean, quite frankly, like I was actually talking to somebody the other day, like with about Mark Carney bribing members of Parliament to cross the floor to get a majority. If Mark Carney succeeds in bribing 2 more MPs to cross the floor so that he gets a majority government without an election, the anger in Alberta will be volcanic. I think that would be what it would take to put Alberta over the top in terms of a yes vote on independence. Because it's, like we already see Canada as a non-democratic elected dictatorship, run by people that are effectively in bed with communist China, that have communist Chinese tendencies. When you look at, the various bills that are coming down to limit free speech. I mean, Mark Miller wanting to have editorial control over the Bible, the Quran, and the Torah. Like,
Yeah, I saw that.
like it's crazy stuff, right? And it's, people in Alberta just won't tolerate it.
That's actually a very interesting point about the majority. Something I've been covering a lot, the floor crossings and everything. So that's very interesting. Let's talk a bit now about the criticisms of the idea of an independent Alberta. And the first argument I hear a lot is the idea of Alberta being a landlocked province. And they'll say, and I've heard the people say, well, BC's blocking your pipelines now. They'll just continue blocking your pipelines. And we've had Donald Trump say in the past, we don't need Canadian oil or Albertan oil. So isn't there a risk that by becoming landlocked, you could actually be worse off than you are right now?
No. And I mean, let's back up a minute. When President Trump says things like that, he's just trying to get a rise out of people, and he's, trying to get people upset for, read The Art of the Deal, right? He's trying to set the tone for the USMCA negotiations that are coming up, later this year, right? We, as a result of, I think, as you may know, I've been leading a delegation to Washington to meet with senior people in the
Yeah,
State
I'll
Department
have
in
a
the
question
U.S.
about that
And
soon.
but as a result of those meetings, Scott Bessent, the U.S. Secretary of Treasury, who, to my mind, when you look at the power of the U.S. Treasury, is the second most powerful man in the world, said, "Oh, I hear that Alberta might be interested in independence." Ha ha, talking to Jack Posobiec, right? And then he says, "Oh, and I understand that Albertans might want a pipeline, down through the states to the Pacific Northwest. We'd be open to that. We'd like them to come down here." So we have an alternative route, to the West Coast. All we need to do is get rid of Ottawa and get them out of the way so we can negotiate directly with the United States to have a pipeline through Montana, Idaho, and either Oregon or Washington to service the California market, to service our actual allies in the Trans-Pacific Partnership like South Korea and Japan, as opposed to simply having all of our feedstock and our oil and gas locked up for communist China until China's ready to have a pipeline built to take 100% of our product to communist China, which is effectively what's happening. Do you think, do you think there's going to be a First Nations veto the minute China wants a pipeline? Do you think there's going to be a veto for, communist British Columbia the minute communist China wants a pipeline? Of course not, right? But the very fact that Alberta independence and the independence movement has been able at the highest level to open up an alternative pipeline route, or the ability to talk about an alternative pipeline route to the Pacific Northwest through the United States, has taken their power away. Like, why do you think that David Eby was jumping up and down and calling me treasonous and calling me a traitor and, just, whatever? It was right on the heels of Secretary of State Bessent saying they would welcome an Alberta pipeline through the U.S. to the Pacific Northwest. And we were taking David Eby's power away because we were taking away his ability to veto a pipeline, his ability to veto Alberta oil and gas development and keep oil and gas locked in Alberta. Like, effectively taking his ability to landlock Alberta away, right? So, that's why, I say that, you don't have to worry about Alberta being landlocked. On top of it, think of the leverage, right? Um, BC, you don't want to give us a pipeline? Okay, well, we're very proud of our rat-free status in Alberta, right? We don't want any Vancouver rats coming into Alberta on trucks or trains. So we're going to stop all of your trucks and trains at the border for 2 weeks. Well, we put rat inspectors on board to, look for NDP rats from Vancouver on the trucks and trains coming, going east right to Ontario. That's 70% of BC's trade, by the way. And then while we're at it, we'll have our tariff inspectors come on board and we'll put a value on the goods and we'll assess a throughput tariff, right? Or you want to be reasonable and give us a pipeline, right? I think it would be a very short negotiation, right? So we're more landlocked within Canada than we would be outside of Canada, is what everybody needs to internalize.
So you talked a bit about the delegations to the U.S. What was the purpose of these trips? Who did you meet with? And was anyone in the delegation or has any independence activists actually met with Donald Trump?
Well, no meetings that I'm aware of. I mean, I don't know about Cameron Davies. He might have met with Donald Trump, but nobody from our delegation. We were meeting with senior officials at the U.S. State Department, and obviously, we've been asked to maintain the confidentiality of the identity of the people in those meetings. But you can see from that interview with Secretary of State Besant that what was going on in those meetings was being briefed to the highest level, in the U.S. government. Right. And in fact, we were told by people that were in the meetings with us that, one meeting had to be cut short because one of the principals in our meeting had to run and go straight to the Oval Office from where we were meeting. So, we're not we're not meeting at a low junior level within the State Department. That's for sure. Yeah.
There's been some talks in the legacy media, especially of concerns of foreign interference from the U.S. in a potential referendum campaign. Is that something you're worried about, that
No.
the American government would try to influence the referendum?
No, they've been very respectful of the process. I mean, we're meeting with them, as individual citizens to talk to them about the aspirations of a free and independent Alberta. And on behalf of the people in Alberta, what we consider to be our constituents. At the time, it was, members of the Alberta Prosperity Project that, that were working with us to educate Albertans on the benefits of independence. Um, it's important for Albertans to know what the attitude of the United States of America is towards U.S. independence. Alberta independence. And I have to say the attitude of the U.S. administration towards Alberta independence is overwhelmingly enthusiastic. And keep in mind, that is Alberta independence, not Alberta statehood. Because in these meetings, the senior people in the State Department we were meeting with are very clear on the fact that Alberta will never become a U.S. state. Because for Alberta to become a state, it would require, a vote in the Senate. For the Senate to vote Alberta in, the Democrats would want, Puerto Rico, Guam, maybe a constitutional amendment to bring in Washington, D.C. to balance off what would be a Republican Alberta.
Yeah.
It's never going to happen, is what we were told in the meetings in Washington. And we're happy with that because the vast majority of our movement, we have some people that would like to see Alberta become a state, but the vast majority of our movement favors Alberta independence with a strong and improved relationship with the United States, kind of like the old common market was in Europe before all the European Union bureaucrats ruined it, right? So just complete free trade between Alberta and the United States, free flow of citizens, across the border. Alberta would be open for all forms of American business. No restrictions on American financial institutions, et cetera, et cetera. It would be a very strong and robust economic relationship going forward. And then keep in mind, 90%, or it's about 80, 88, 89, 90% of all of Alberta's trade now is north and south anyway, right? So we don't need Canada. Canada needs us, right? But if we were to become independent and if Canada wanted to play hardball, I mean, all we'd have to do is increase our trade with the United States by 10 or 12%, and we'd replace whatever trade we have with Canada. And that would be a very simple thing to do. One pipeline to the Pacific Northwest, another pipeline to the Gulf of America that doesn't go through the Midwest hub, increased, agricultural exports, manufacturing, increased trade by, financial services, et cetera. We could easily replace that 10% trade, almost in a matter of weeks, if not months.
So in Quebec, when there was the separatist movement there, some business was driven out of the province and they moved their headquarters to Toronto, for example. Do you have any concerns that a growing independence movement in Alberta could drive some business out of the province?
No, in fact, I think the evidence has been quite the opposite, right? So if you look, Danielle, and I don't have it here on my phone. I wish I did. I'll send you the slides so you can
Sure.
post it. But she posted not too long ago that since basically the Alberta independence movement has just leapt forward in the last year. So from February of last year to today, job growth in Alberta has increased by like 85,000 jobs, while the rest of the country cumulatively has declined 33,000 jobs. So, far from hurting Alberta from a growth perspective, I think that Alberta independence is actually helping the economy in Alberta, right? I know of businesses in Ontario that have sold. One gentleman had a chain of small grocery stores in rural Ontario, sold all of his stores, brought all of his money to Alberta, and he's starting new businesses in southern Alberta because he wants to be here for independence and he wants to get out of what's become communist Ontario, right? And we see that more and more. Businesses selling out in BC, people moving in from BC to Alberta, people moving from Ontario, Manitoba, the Maritimes to open businesses in Alberta because lower taxes, the future of a zero income tax environment, zero corporate tax environment in Alberta, or federal corporate tax environment in Alberta going forward. I mean, these are all very positive things, for people going forward. So, and again, the dynamic in Quebec, like Sun Life, I think was the big example, right?
Yes.
Sun Life was more about language, right? Their C-suite at Sun Life was predominantly English, right? They didn't want to change the language of their business. They didn't want to be dictated to by the government of Quebec, as to the form of their business forms and everything else. And then they were also concerned that an independent government in Quebec or a more Péquiste government in Quebec would become increasingly socialist, higher levels of taxation, and so on. So that's why those businesses were leaving Quebec. It wasn't because of independence, right? We have the opposite issue in Alberta, and I always say jokingly at at forums and town halls, if this question comes up, it's like, okay, how many people here are in business, like actually in business, right? And people in the crowd will raise their hand. And I said, so how many people that are actually in business have ever heard of a business saying, I'm going to move because I don't want to be in a jurisdiction that taxes me less and regulates me more, or, regulates me more, right? Or regulates me less, right? So
Yeah.
who's going to move, a business so that they can be taxed more and regulated more? Nobody, right? And quite frankly, the types of businesses that thrive on government regulation, that thrive on government subsidies and so on, we don't want them here anyway. They can go, to Quebec and Ontario where they belong, where they can get liberal handouts that'll no longer be paid for, by the people of Alberta.
What would Alberta independence mean for treaty rights, for First Nations? I'm aware that there's a court case going on right now, and there's some members of Indigenous communities that have said that basically Alberta independence would violate our rights. I know you've done some Indigenous law in your time as a lawyer. So
I have
what would
won.
that mean?
I have won more treaty rights cases than any other lawyer in Canada. I'm confident in saying that. I know the Alberta treaties and the oral promises in and around those treaties backwards and forwards. I, in fact, won a case at the Supreme Court of Canada that said not that the oral promises were an interpretive aid to the treaties, but that the oral promises themselves form part of the treaties. I would not be involved in this if I thought for 1 second that Alberta independence wouldn't enhance treaty rights in the province and that treaty rights wouldn't have greater respect and greater protection in a free and independent Alberta than they do now, right? Look at the poverty that Alberta First Nations live in, right? I know communities in northern Alberta that don't have safe drinking water, that literally have 3 and 4 generations of a family living in, a crappy 1,200 square foot CMHC house. They don't have doors to close in the winter. They're hanging blankets over, over the doorways to keep from freezing at -40, et cetera, et cetera. This is the level of poverty that the government of Canada has left these people in. It is despicable. So, I don't understand for the life of me why certain chiefs in Alberta are so concerned about $15 billion in equalization no longer going to Quebec so that it can stay in Alberta, so that the new government of Alberta can enter into a constitutionalized resource revenue sharing agreement with the First Nations of Alberta that would see their community's revenues triple, right? Like, for the life of me, I can't figure it out, right? The other thing, that I'd like to note, while we're talking about this, is that we have literally thousands of First Nations people that have signed the petition, right? We have First Nations people that are volunteering as canvassers, that are, that are strongly in support of Alberta independence. I can guarantee you that there is far more Indigenous support for Alberta independence than there are chiefs in Alberta.
Jeff, is there anything else that you'd like to say or add?
Well, I just want to again reiterate the fact that, people that are voting for independence in Alberta know what they're voting for, right? We're voting to eliminate, an entire level of taxation from our lives. All federal taxes will be gone and replaced by sensible taxes by people that are responsive to Albertans in Alberta. We think we can reduce the overall tax burden in Alberta and a free and independent Alberta by well over 50%. We know that we can eliminate all of the regulations from Ottawa that make our lives miserable on an ongoing basis. And we're going to solve all of the structural problems that we currently experience within Confederation, including having no leverage whatsoever to negotiate with communist premiers like David Eby, who think they have a veto over the Alberta oil and gas industry. We're going to have improved trade and relationship with the United States. We're not going to have to listen to premiers like, Doug Ford jumping up and down and wanting to stick his, thumb in the eye of, President Trump, along with Donald Carney, harming Alberta's relationship with the United States. Just wait till CA comes along, and we're going to see where all this U.S. hatred has gotten us, right, at the time of that negotiation. So, I think Alberta has a brilliant future as soon as it gets out of Canada. The sooner we get out of Canada, the better. And, for us, this isn't a negotiating tactic. We're not going, oh, let's get to yes so we can get, more money from somebody like Rene Lévesque did, at the first referendum, right? Nobody's going to give us any more money, right? Other than what we say is we have enough of our own money here. We just need you people to stop stealing it and leaving us develop our own economy without interference by, people in Ottawa that don't like us, don't care for us, don't understand us, and only come to talk to us when, they need our few votes to get them into power, nationally. But, and again, while pandering to Quebec and Ontario. So, that's how I see things going forward. I'm looking forward to a very entertaining referendum campaign once the signature goal is met, and we're going to keep moving forward.
Well, Jeff Rath, thank you so much for...
My pleasure. Thanks for coming on. Yeah.
Of course.
For having me on. Thank you.
And this concludes our interview with Jeff Rath. I want to know what you think, so comment your thoughts down below, and be sure to like this video and subscribe and hit the notification bell not to miss the next one. And if you want to see some additional questions, there are some additional questions that I couldn't fit into this 30-minute interview, then click the links down below to become a channel member, and you'll be able to see these bonus questions. They are not to be missed. They are very interesting, and it helps me stay independent. Stay tuned for other videos on Alberta independence and Canadian politics and other very interesting topics. And until then, God bless.